The sound of cement splashing into water wasn't something Michael Anderson ever expected to hear in his own backyard. Yet there it was, an unmistakable thick, wet slap followed by a thunderous curse that could only belong to one person, Diane Holloway, the self-appointed queen of the Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association. Michael froze by his kitchen window, coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips, watching in stunned disbelief as his neighbor of 3 years tipped another bucket of quick-setting cement into his pristine swimming pool. The morning sun glinted off the once crystal blue water, now marred by expanding gray clouds of industrial poison. "What the hell are you doing?" Michael shouted, nearly tripping over his golden retriever as he bolted through his sliding glass door. The mug shattered on his patio, spraying hot coffee across the concrete. Diane whirled around, her meticulously highlighted blonde bob swinging with military precision. Her thin lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Enforcing the bylaws, Michael. Section 7, paragraph 12, pools must be properly maintained at all times." She gestured to the ruined water with manicured nails painted the exact shade of the HOA letterhead. "Your chlorine levels were out of compliance last Tuesday. I sent you 3 notices." Michael stood slack-jawed, unable to process the scene before him. His pool, the reason he purchased this house, the place where his kids played during their weekend visits, the sanctuary he retreated to after 12-hour shifts at the hospital, was being systematically destroyed by a woman clutching a laminated copy of HOA regulations like a holy text. "Those notices gave you 72 hours to correct the issue," Diane continued with bureaucratic precision. "The deadline has expired. As per Section 19, the HOA board is authorized to take corrective measures at the homeowner's expense." She checked her watch. "You'll receive the bill for the cement and labor by Friday." "You can't do this." Michael finally managed, his shock giving way to rage. "This is my property." Diane's smile tightened. "Actually, I can. You signed the agreement when you moved in. Perhaps you should have read the fine print." The worst part was, Michael knew she was technically correct. The Sunnyside Estates HOA wielded extraordinary power that Diane had spent years consolidating since becoming president. What had started as a reasonable organization to maintain property values had morphed into Diane's personal fiefdom, with residents living in fear of her clipboard and citation pad. Michael wasn't the first victim. Last summer, she ordered the destruction of Mrs. Patel's award-winning rose garden for being 2 inches over the permitted garden boundary. The month before, she towed Mr. Ramirez's vintage car from his own driveway for having non-regulation tires. Each time, she hid behind bylaws so complex that no working person had time to master them. As Diane walked away, her sensible heels clicking on the pavement, Michael stood amid the chemical stench of ruined water and setting cement. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the hospital calling him in for another emergency shift. Perfect timing. "This isn't over," he called after her. Diane didn't bother turning around, just waved the HOA manual over her shoulder. "It is, unless you want to appeal at next month's meeting. I'll be chairing it, of course." Something snapped in Michael at that moment. He was a reasonable man, a doctor who saved lives, a father who taught his children about responsibility and respect. But as he watched Diane disappear into her immaculately landscaped yard next door, he made a decision. Karen had finally messed with the wrong neighbor, and Michael was going to get payback, the ultimate payback. Michael spent 3 days in a fog of rage. The pool remediation company had delivered the devastating news. Complete drainage, jackhammering, resurfacing, and refilling would cost him nearly $30,000. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Apparently, malicious HOA enforcement wasn't in his policy. To add insult to injury, a courier had indeed delivered an invoice from the Sunnyside Estates HOA for corrective maintenance measures, totaling $267.42 for the cement Diane had used to destroy his property. He barely slept, his mind cycling through increasingly elaborate revenge fantasies, each more impractical than the last. His ex-wife Linda had called twice, concerned about his terse texts regarding canceling the kids' weekend visit. "You don't sound like yourself," she'd said. "The Michael I know doesn't get pushed around." That sentence kept echoing in his head as he sat in his backyard on Saturday morning, staring at the ruined pool. The cement had hardened into grotesque gray stalagmites rising from the shallow end like some post-apocalyptic art installation. "Holy crap, Doc. She really did a number on you." Michael turned to see his neighbor from across the street, Tony Ramirez, leaning over the fence. The retired mechanic whistled low as he surveyed the damage. "Heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine. Thought people were exaggerating, but..." Tony shook his head. "The Dragon Lady's gone too far this time." "Dragon Lady?" Michael asked, accepting the beer Tony offered over the fence. "That's what we call her when she's not around. Been terrorizing this neighborhood for 3 years now." Tony took a swig from his own bottle. Before he moved in, this was a normal place. Then Diane's husband got that big promotion, and suddenly she needed a project, ran for HOA president unopposed because nobody wanted the headache. Now we're all living under martial law with floral arrangements. As they talked, Michael learned he was far from Diane's only victim. Tony's vintage Mustang, Mrs. Patel's roses, the Wilsons' basketball hoop, the Jacksons' holiday decorations. One by one, Diane had targeted her neighbors using increasingly obscure HOA bylaws, building a reputation so fearsome that most people simply complied with her demands rather than face her wrath. "Why doesn't anyone fight back?" Michael asked. Tony sighed. "Her husband's the biggest real estate developer in the county. She's got 2 lawyers on speed dial. And besides, she's technically not breaking any rules. Everything she does is in those bylaws we all signed." Michael took a long pull from his beer, an idea beginning to form. "The bylaws," he repeated slowly. "Has anyone actually read all of them? The entire thing? Nobody's got time for that, Doc. It's like 200 pages of legal mumbo-jumbo. That's how she gets away with it. She's the only one who knows every obscure clause." Michael set his beer down, a newfound determination cutting through his exhaustion. "Well, that's about to change. I need to borrow your copy of the HOA regulations." Tony raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning?" "I'm not sure yet," Michael admitted. "But I know the first rule of battle. Know your enemy. And if Diane's weapon of choice is those bylaws, then I need to become a better expert on them than she is." That evening, Michael spread the massive HOA document across his dining room table. He worked methodically, highlighting sections, making notes, cross-referencing clauses. His medical training had prepared him for absorbing complex information, and he approached the task with surgical precision. By midnight, patterns began to emerge. Contradictions, loopholes. Amendments that had been added during Diane's tenure that subtly expanded the HOA's authority, specifically her authority. The bylaws were less a governance document and more a power grab disguised as community standards. At 2 a.m. on page 174, he found it. Section 23, paragraph 7, subparagraph B, forgotten clause from the original HOA charter that had never been formally removed. His heart raced as he read it again, confirming what he discovered. Michael leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face for the first time in days. He reached for his phone and began taking pictures of the relevant sections. Then he started making calls. Karen had been using the bylaws as a weapon for years. Now Michael was going to turn those same bylaws into a precision-guided missile aimed directly at her immaculate lawn. Michael spent the next week moving with the calculated precision of a chess grandmaster. During the day, he maintained his usual routine, leaving for the hospital at dawn, returning after dark. To any watching eyes, particularly Diane's, which he frequently caught peering through her Venetian blinds, he appeared defeated. He even paid the $267.42 invoice without protest, which clearly disappointed Diane when she cornered him by his mailbox. "I trust you'll be more attentive to pool maintenance in the future," she said with barely concealed satisfaction. "Once you've had it properly repaired, of course." Michael had simply nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I've learned my lesson about following the bylaws to the letter, Diane." She'd seemed almost disappointed by his lack of resistance, unaware that beneath his calm exterior, an elaborate plan was taking shape. What Diane didn't know was that Michael's hospital shifts had been rearranged. The hours he wasn't at home, he was meeting with key allies. Tony Ramirez, whose vintage car knowledge would prove invaluable. Lakshmi Patel, whose roses had been destroyed but whose husband happened to be a paralegal. James Wilson, a contractor who understood building codes better than anyone. And most importantly, Eleanor Finch, the 78-year-old original developer of Sunnyside Estates, who still kept every document from the neighborhood's founding tucked away in her basement. "I wrote those original bylaws myself," Eleanor had told Michael over tea in her immaculate living room. "Before all these young hotshots started adding their legal nonsense. We wanted to build a community, not a dictatorship." Eleanor's eyes had twinkled as Michael explained his discovery and his plan. "Section 23 was my insurance policy," she chuckled. "I'd always wondered if someone would find it. You'll need documentation, of course, and witnesses." By Friday, Michael was ready. He'd taken the day off work, his first sick day in 3 years, and waited until 10 a.m. when Diane left for her weekly salon appointment. The moment her Mercedes disappeared around the corner, Michael's team sprang into action. Tony arrived first with his nephew, who operated a drone photography business. They systematically documented every inch of Diane's property from above, capturing high-resolution images. Meanwhile, Lakshmi's husband measured and photographed from the sidewalk, meticulously recording specific features of Diane's home. "Just as I thought," James Wilson said, consulting the municipal building code on his tablet. "Those decorative columns on her porch extend exactly 7.3 inches into the setback zone. And that's just for starters. Eleanor arrived last, moving slowly with her cane, but with a determined gleam of a general surveying a battlefield. "Let me see what my successor has been up to," she said, examining Diane's property with a critical eye. "My goodness, there must be 24 violations. The hedges alone." They worked quickly and methodically, compiling evidence into a folder that grew thicker by the hour. Michael checked his watch repeatedly. Diane's salon appointments typically lasted 3 hours, hair, nails, and what she called her weekly face refresh. At 12:30, just as they were wrapping up, disaster struck. A familiar Mercedes turned the corner early. "She's back," Tony hissed. "Everyone clear out." The team scattered, but Michael stood his ground on the public sidewalk, the folder tucked casually under his arm. He'd known this confrontation might happen and was prepared. Diane's car screeched to a halt beside him. She emerged like a thundercloud, her fresh highlights practically crackling with electricity. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching toward him. "Loitering is a violation of Section 11. Michael smiled pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Diane. I'm just out for a walk. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Her eyes narrowed, darting to the folder under his arm. "What's that? Are you documenting something? On my property?" "Just exercising my rights as a homeowner and a HOA member," Michael replied calmly. "Section 23, paragraph 7, subparagraph B. You should look it up sometime." For the first time since Michael had known her, Diane Holloway looked uncertain. "There is no such," she began, and faltered. "What are you talking about?" "The reciprocal compliance clause," Michael said. "Original bylaws, never amended or removed. It states that any HOA board member who files a complaint against a resident must themselves be in complete compliance with all bylaws and municipal codes. Any violations, even a single one, nullifies their authority to file complaints and requires immediate rectification of any actions taken against other homeowners." He patted the folder, at their expense, of course. The color drained from Diane's face. "That's ridiculous. I would know if." "The monthly meeting is Tuesday," Michael continued smoothly. "I've already requested time to present my findings. Eleanor Finch will be there too. You know, the original developer who wrote the bylaws. She's quite eager to see how the neighborhood has evolved under your leadership." Diane's perfectly lined lips opened and closed without sound. For perhaps the first time in her life, the HOA president was speechless. Michael checked his watch. "I should get going. I have a pool restoration company coming to provide an estimate. I'll be sure to include their quote in my presentation on Tuesday." He turned to leave and paused. "Oh, and Diane, you might want to measure those porch columns before the meeting, and the hedges, and check the paint color on your garden shed. It doesn't quite match the approved palette." As he walked away, Michael could feel Diane's eyes burning into his back. He didn't need to turn around to know she was already on her phone, probably calling her husband or her lawyers. Let her. The documentation was airtight, the witnesses lined up, and the bylaws clear. For 3 years, Diane had terrorized the neighborhood with her clipboard and citation pad. Now Michael had his own clipboard, and Tuesday's meeting promised to be the most memorable in Sunnyside Estates history. The Sunnyside Estates Community Center had never seen such attendance for an HOA meeting. By 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday, 15 minutes before the scheduled start, every folding chair was filled. Residents who had spent years avoiding these meetings suddenly found themselves drawn to what promised to be the neighborhood's equivalent of a heavyweight championship fight. Michael sat in the front row, his evidence folder neatly placed on his lap, flanked by Tony and Lakshmi. Eleanor Finch sat regally in a special chair with cushions, holding court among longtime residents who hadn't attended meetings in years. The room hummed with anticipation, whispered conversations creating a steady background noise. At precisely 6:55, the side door opened and Diane entered. The room fell silent. She looked different. The immaculate helmet of highlighted hair was still in place, but her usual confident stride had been replaced by something stiffer, more measured. Her trademark clipboard was conspicuously absent. Most tellingly, instead of her usual power suit, she wore a simple black dress, funeral attire for her reign as HOA queen. Behind her trailed her husband, Richard Holloway, his expensive suit and carefully crafted smile, unable to hide the tension in his jaw. And behind him came a thin man with glasses who could only be a lawyer, given the oversized briefcase he carried. "Good evening," Diane said, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone as she took her place at the head table. "I see we have quite a turnout tonight." She attempted to proceed with the usual agenda, approval of last month's minutes, treasurer's report, landscaping committee updates, but the room's energy made it clear no one was interested in these formalities. Finally, after 15 excruciating minutes, she reached the item everyone was waiting for. "We have a special presentation from Dr. Michael Anderson," she announced, unable to completely mask the tremor in her voice. Michael rose smoothly, carrying his folder to the podium. The projector had been set up earlier by James Wilson, who gave him a subtle thumbs up from his position by the light switch. "Thank you, Diane," Michael began, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used when explaining difficult diagnosis to patients. "I'm here tonight to discuss a matter of considerable importance to our community, namely the equal application of our HOA bylaws." For the next 20 minutes, Michael methodically presented his findings. The drum photos appear on the screen, each one highlighting specific violations of Diane's property: the columns that exceeded setback limitations, hedges 2 inches taller than regulation, unapproved modifications to her backyard pergola, a garden shed painted coastal beige instead of the approved sandstone, and a dozen other infractions that individually might seem trivial, but together painted a picture of blatant hypocrisy. "In total, I have documented 27 distinct violations of our HOA bylaws on the Holloway property," Michael concluded, some dating back nearly 2 years. The room remained eerily silent. Michael could see Richard Holloway whispering urgently to his lawyer, who looked increasingly concerned. "However, these violations alone are not why I'm standing here today," Michael continued. "I'm here because of Section 23, Paragraph 7, Subparagraph B of our original bylaws, what I've come to call the Reciprocal Compliance Clause." He nodded to James, who switched the projector to display the relevant text, enlarged so everyone could read it. "This clause, which has never been amended or removed from our bylaws, clearly states that any HOA board member who files a complaint or takes enforcement action against another resident must themselves be in complete compliance with all bylaws and municipal codes. Any violations, even a single one, nullifies their authority to file complaints and requires immediate rectification of any actions taken against other homeowners at the board member's personal expense." A murmur swept through the room. Michael gestured to Eleanor Finch, who rose slowly to her feet. "I can confirm the authenticity of this clause," Eleanor said, her voice frail but clear. "I wrote it myself when these bylaws were drafted. It was designed precisely to prevent the kind of selective enforcement we've been seeing." Richard Holloway was now openly conferring with his lawyer, their whispered conversation growing heated. Diane sat frozen, her face a mask. "Given the documented violations at the Holloway residence," Michael continued, "I formally move that, in accordance with Section 23, all enforcement actions taken by Diane Holloway over the past 3 years be declared null and void, and that she be personally responsible for rectifying any damages caused by those actions." He placed a thick stack of papers on the table in front of Diane, including but not limited to the complete restoration of my pool, which was damaged under her direction on March 17th of this year. "I've taken the liberty of obtaining 3 quotes from reputable pool restoration companies. The average cost is $32,457.88. The room erupted. Residents who had suffered under Diane's reign began calling out their own grievances. Mrs. Patel demanded compensation for her roses. The Wilsons wanted reimbursement for their basketball hoop. Tony Ramirez calculated the storage fees for his vintage Mustang. 3 days after the explosive HOA meeting, Michael found himself in a position he never expected: community organizer. His dining room had become command central for what the neighbors now called the Sunnyside Rebellion. Residents streamed in and out, bringing documentation of past HOA abuses, reviewing bylaws, and coordinating their response to the Holloway regime. "The Wilsons just dropped this off," Lakshmi said, placing another folder on the growing stack. Diane cited them for their holiday lights last December. Apparently, they were 3 days past the January removal deadline. She had their power cut off until they complied. Michael shook his head in disbelief. How did one person get away with this for so long? "Fear and isolation," Tony replied, sorting through violation notices. "She always picked us off one by one. Nobody wanted to be her next target, so we kept our heads down. Until you came along." Michael had barely slept since the meeting. The Holloways had gone silent. No response to his formal demands for restitution, no appearance at their usual community spots. Their house remained shuttered, blinds drawn. Richards pulled this vanishing act before, Eleanor Finch explained during one of her visits. When things get uncomfortable, they retreat and regroup. That's when they're most dangerous. The old woman was right. On Friday morning, Michael's doorbell rang at 7 a.m. Outside stood a courier with a thick envelope bearing the logo of Holloway Development Corporation. Inside was a settlement offer: $10,000 for pool repairs, contingent upon Michael signing a non-disclosure agreement and withdrawing all claims against Diane. Attached was a letter from their attorney explaining that while they disputed the enforceability of obsolete bylaw provisions, they were offering this sum as a gesture of goodwill. Michael showed the offer to Lakshmi's husband, who snorted in derision. "This is insulting. They're trying to buy your silence cheaply and isolate you from the other homeowners." By noon, they discovered that every resident who had spoken up at the meeting had received similar lowball offers, each tailored to their specific complaint. The Holloways were trying to divide and conquer. "They're afraid of us working together," Michael realized. That's their weakness. He called an emergency meeting that evening in his backyard. Despite the short notice, nearly 30 homeowners attended, many bringing folding chairs and snacks as if preparing for a neighborhood picnic. They want to settle with us individually, Michael explained, standing beside his ruined pool, which had become a powerful symbol of HOA overreach. But united, we have leverage they can't ignore. The group voted unanimously to reject the individual offers and present a collective demand. Full restitution for all documented damages, Diane's immediate resignation from the HOA board, and a complete revision of the bylaws to prevent future abuses. What none of them expected was the Holloway's next move. Saturday morning, residents woke to find glossy flyers in their mailboxes announcing a special community meeting called by Richard Holloway himself. The flyer featured a professional photograph of Richard and Diane standing before their homes smiling warmly. Join us to discuss exciting new developments for our community, the text read. Refreshments will be served. It's a trap, Tony said when he called Michael. Richard's trying to outmaneuver us. Michael agreed but saw an opportunity. We need to be there in force. Every household. This is our chance to confront them publicly. Word spread quickly. By Sunday evening, the rebellion had a plan. Monday's meeting was held in the local elementary school gymnasium, a larger venue than the community center, clearly chosen to accommodate a crowd. Tables of catered food lined one wall. A professional sound system had been set up. Large banners displaying artistic renderings of neighborhood improvements hung from the walls. Richard Holloway stood on a small stage, microphone in hand, the picture of successful confidence in his tailored suit. Diane sat nearby, her expression carefully neutral, her posture rigid. Friends and neighbors, Richard began once the room had filled. My wife and I called this meeting because we believe in the future of Sunnyside Estates. Recent misunderstandings have distracted us from our shared vision of making this the premier community in the county. Michael sat with Tony, Lakshmi, and Eleanor in the front row, watching as Richard unveiled his strategy. It was masterful, a complete reframing of the situation. Richard spoke of communication breakdowns and differing interpretations of community standards. He never directly mentioned the HOA disputes or Diane's actions. Then came the carrot. Richard announced that Holloway Development was prepared to invest $2 million in community improvements, a state-of-the-art playground, repaved roads, enhanced landscaping, and a complete renovation of the community center. These improvements will increase every home's value by at least 15%, Richard said, clicking through slides of beautiful renderings. All we ask is that we put recent disagreements behind us and focus on our shared future. The state attorney general's investigation into Sunnyside Estates lasted 4 months. For Michael and his neighbors, it was a period of cautious optimism mixed with bureaucratic frustration. Investigators interviewed dozens of residents, examined years of HOA records, and scrutinized the relationship between the association and Holloway Development Corporation. The Holloways themselves had essentially vanished from community life. Their house remained occupied. Lights came on in the evenings, mail was collected. But Diane was no longer seen patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard, and Richard's luxury sedan was conspicuously absent from the driveway most days. My cousin works at Richard's office downtown, Tony told Michael over beers one evening. Says he's been holed up with lawyers for weeks. Apparently, the investigation expanded to include some of his other developments. Rumors circulated that the Holloways were planning to sell their house and relocate. Property listings were checked daily. But for now, they remained silent, isolated neighbors who had gone from community tyrants to neighborhood ghosts. In the power vacuum left by Diane's absence, an interim HOA board had been elected, with Eleanor Finch serving as honorary chairperson and Michael reluctantly accepting a position despite his protests that he was too busy at the hospital. Their first act had been to suspend all enforcement of aesthetic bylaws pending a complete review and revision of the regulations. It's like the neighborhood can breathe again, Lakshmi observed one Saturday as children played on front lawns that had previously been off-limits, basketball hoops appeared in driveways, and gardens expanded beyond their formerly strict boundaries. On a bright September morning, exactly 6 months after Diane had poured cement into his pool, Michael received a certified letter from the state attorney general's office. He immediately called an emergency meeting of the neighborhood's core group. They gathered in Michael's backyard, now featuring a fully restored pool with an expanded deck area that would have sent Diane into conniptions under the old regime. Tony, Lakshmi, and her husband, the Wilsons, Eleanor Finch, and a dozen others waited expectantly as Michael opened the envelope. The investigation has concluded, he read aloud. The findings indicate systematic violations of state housing regulations, improper enforcement procedures, and multiple conflicts of interest between the Sunnyside Estates HOA and Holloway Development Corporation. A cheer went up from the group. The office has negotiated a settlement agreement rather than pursuing criminal charges, Michael continued. The terms include full restitution to all affected homeowners for documented damages resulting from improper HOA enforcement actions. The settlement amounts were listed in an attachment: every garden destroyed, every vehicle towed, every improvement forcibly removed, every fine improperly levied would be repaid with interest. Michael's pool restoration was covered in full with additional compensation for emotional distress and loss of use. Additionally, Michael Reed, his voice growing stronger, Holloway Development Corporation has agreed to establish a $3.5 million community improvement fund to be administered by an elected resident committee with no connection to the Holloway family or business interests. The group exchanged stunned glances. It was more than Richard had offered at his attempted bribery meeting, and this time the money came with no strings attached. "There's more," Michael said, turning to the next page. "The settlement prohibits Diane Holloway from serving in any HOA or community governance position in this county for a period of 10 years. Richard Holloway is required to divest his company of all development interests within a 5-mile radius of Sunnyside Estates and must disclose this settlement in all future permit applications statewide." The implications were clear. Richard's business would survive, but his reputation was permanently damaged. His days of leveraging political connections for preferential treatment were over. And finally, Michael Reed, reaching the last paragraph: the current HOA bylaws are deemed legally deficient. Residents must vote on